Hello friends, and welcome to another edition of Transformational Astrology. I'm Henry Seltzer, and we're going to be talking about the new moon that's coming up this weekend, as we always do. And this particular new moon is quite exciting because it's not only an eclipse, it's right on the solstice. Well, that is to say, it's the same degree as the solstice. It takes place much after the exact moment of the solstice, late in the evening of Saturday. If you're on the West Coast, actually it'll be already over the midnight line if you're on the East Coast. So it'll be the 21st early in the morning, East Coast in Europe. But in any case, so that's the new moon energy itself coming in. But the fact that it's so close to the solstice, that it is in the solstice degree, the eclipse degree is 0 degrees of Cancer. We are going to be considering this to be a very particularly powerful new moon event, which eclipses always are. But this eclipse is also on the solstice. So we feel like the solstice is a chart that we use to tell what's happening because it's the quarter of the year. You know, the equinoxes and the solstice at the 0 degree point of the cardinal signs are very strong that way. We look at the winter solstice for an idea about the year to come. We are looking at the summer solstice, or what we call the summer solstice here in the Northern Hemisphere, of course. We're looking at this Cancer solstice as maybe the last 6 months of the year to get a feeling for what's happening that way. And in fact, because an eclipse also lasts 6 months, we can consider this to be a pretty powerful moment in time, and a pretty powerful moment in time for the culture that we're in the midst of, as we can see by the headlines, and a pretty powerful moment in our own individual evolution as well, in concert with the societal evolution that's happening all around us. So let's go to the chart, see what we can see there. And you should be able to see the chart for this new moon on the 20th. It is 11:41 p.m. Pacific time. And you can see the sun and moon at exactly 0 degrees of Cancer in 21 minutes. Down here at the bottom of this chart, which is the natural chart for Eris on the ascendant. And we're going to be talking about a couple of other things that are happening in this chart because they're quite significant as we look at the entire arc of development of the Saturn-Pluto, which is the year that we're in the midst of. Saturn and Pluto were exactly conjunct right at the very beginning of the year, around the 10th of January, with the eclipse of that time, which was a lunar eclipse. So now we don't see Saturn and Pluto together, but we do see actually Jupiter with Saturn, and Jupiter is retrograding up to Saturn. It retrogrades further because closer to the Earth. Jupiter will be getting to the degree of, retrograding towards Pluto is what I meant to say. It will be getting to the degree of Pluto by the end of the month. So this is still powerful at 24 degrees of Capricorn because, you know, it just retrograded there. It was forward, and then Jupiter went past, and then now Jupiter's going back. And so there's just a lot of Jupiter-Pluto at this time in a T-square with some other planets, which are these newer planets that have been just recently named by the IAU, the International Astronomical Union, at the timing of around 2006. We have Eris, which is this glyph, and we also have Haumea, which not too many people are working with right now, but I've been working with. My thinking on these new planets beyond Pluto is that they were named officially as planets, although of the dwarf variety. Dwarf planets meaning that they are Kuiper Belt objects. And but they're still planets, just in the sense that Pluto is a planet. We're certainly not changing the way we look at Pluto in astrology. We know in Western astrology Pluto is very important in the outer three planets of Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. Pluto signifying, by the way, transformation, death, and rebirth. And Pluto with Uranus in the 60s was the hallmark of the 60s. And we have a lot of Uranus still in the sky right now. Now, the little background there is that Uranus and Pluto were actually in a square alignment in the middle of the 20-teens, which is just ending this year. So that even at the beginning of this year, they were still an orb of having that square alignment. So what we're seeing with that opening square of the alignment of Uranus and Pluto from the 60s is we're seeing if those ideas from the 60s are viable in the actual society. It was kind of beside the actual society. There was mainstream and there was alternative culture in the 60s. But these ideas from the alternative culture were, of course, the ideas that we could have peace, love, and understanding. All those 60 songs, what's wrong with peace, love, and understanding? We can have a way of treating each other that is with kindness, that is not with suspicion and not with fear and not with racism, as we're having the big expose right now. Isn't it amazing what's going on in the culture? Because perhaps partly related to this COVID cultural reset that we've been experiencing, people have a thoughtful period of time to look into themselves, look into the society, think about things, and then this very blatant police brutality that was so you couldn't ask for a more iconic instance. It was horrible to watch, that a man being executed, basically killed in front of our eyes over 8 minutes and 46 seconds of time. That is so iconic and so redolent of the situation that has been discussed for years. Black Lives Matter, an organization that's been around for many years, but now given extra poignancy by this event on Memorial Day, which did shape the current protests, and there's been like 21, 22 days of protests since then, because it is so poignant. And now this new event in Atlanta, which is in the current news, are very blatant. Also, there was a peaceful convocation between the cops and this guy in a Wendy's in the drive-through lane, and he moved his car and he gave him his driver's license, but then when they went to put the cuffs on him, without even telling him he was under arrest, he started resisting at that point. He wasn't going to be cuffed, maybe because he'd watched that video. He'd seen what happened to somebody else in Minneapolis that was put in handcuffs and in the kind attention of the police. And it turns out these particular cops, this one cop, had been reprimanded for brutality in the past. I don't want to go into all the current events, but it just to set the stage for what we're in the midst of right now, which to me is very fascinating. And it does involve that we have such a strong Pluto in the sky. You can see, let's go back one more new moon back to what happened on the 22nd, which was the Gemini new moon preceding this Cancer new moon that we're in the midst of now. And the thing I want you to notice, I think is very fascinating, is that the 2-degree mark of this new moon, which was in Gemini on May 22nd, in other words, just before the George Floyd event, which happened, I guess it was that same weekend. It was the 25th, wasn't it? So it's just a few days before the event that took place in Minneapolis on, I believe, the Monday following this event. At this time, we had the 2-degree mark of the new moon, and we had Saturn at just about 2 degrees of Aquarius. So there was this powerful connection, and that not only, you can see that this T-square was still operating. There was Eris at 24 degrees, opposite Haumea, which is this other new planet having to do with a natural understanding, having to do with nature as a spiritual path, having to do with just a enjoyment and appreciation of nature, having to do with charisma that comes from a sort of a natural sense of yourself, that you can create new worlds by having this kind of charisma. David Bowie has it in spades, by the way, and other people like Prince and also Joseph Campbell. Anyway, this opposition makes a perfect T-square to the Jupiter at 27 and Pluto at 24. So this T-square has been going for a while, and it made me think right in the middle of May that, wow, we were in for some serious Pluto stuff, which I hadn't realized was coming up so fast, and at the time I associated with COVID, and I said, well, maybe we're not out of the woods yet with COVID. This is what I said in the middle of May. And sure enough, that's probably the case also, because some places have opened a little too fast and there's been spikes, and who knows how that's going to go. It's tricky, and I think that the COVID situation is still percolating. That's my sense of it. I mean, it's also, people are, some of the states are opening successfully, and it is kind of calming down, although we don't know what's to happen at the end of the year, and I'll be talking about that in a few minutes. So just to set the stage, so this was the new moon preceding this current new moon that we have coming up on Saturday. And we see that there's this total connection between the new moon degree and Saturn, as well as this very strong experience of Pluto. And remembering that we're in a year of Saturn-Pluto, that the Saturn-Pluto conjunction happened around the 10th of January, and then since then, of course, Saturn has moved away and gotten into Aquarius. And now let's take a look at the solstice chart. Okay, now, having started retrograde back again, Saturn is at 0 degrees of Aquarius. And that might ring a bell because you remember that the Saturn-Jupiter, or the Jupiter-Saturn, great conjunction it's called, happens every 20 years, is coming up this year on December 21st on the solstice, the winter solstice, at 0 degrees of Aquarius. And now we have the 0 degree solar eclipse at 0 degrees Cancer, also making a very strong angle. In this case, it's an inconjunct or 150 degree angle to the Saturn. So what I'm trying to say is Saturn is very much part of this configuration as we might expect, and was part of the configuration of the last 30 days as we might expect, because what we're seeing is has to do with the society, has to do with how we're feeling about the way the society is involved. And then we're seeing Saturn as well as Pluto, so that even though they're not conjunct, we are seeing Saturn and Pluto. Not to mention we're also seeing quite a bit of Uranus in this configuration as well. Uranus has moved away from the early degrees of Taurus because it's been hit by all these new moons at the early degrees of the respective signs, but now it's at 9 degrees of Taurus. But nonetheless, there is a connection between this eclipse degree and the Uranus degree because it makes a septile. And I don't think that's being drawn in this because we probably didn't have septile. I'll show you how that works in the time passages software. Just take a little aside. We can go to our preferences. We can choose aspect orbs, and we can say, what about a natal chart? Are we going to be using things like septile? No. Well, let's use septile. And then you can see that the septile does show up. You can put the mouse on it. It says Sun and Moon both in septile within ½ a degree with Uranus. So the fact that Uranus is in this picture too, I kind of like that myself as I'm trying to analyze things, see what's happening here, because there sure is something going on, isn't there? This extended protest about police brutality, mostly peaceful protest, is very remarkable to me. And I'm somebody that grew up through the 60s, so I do know that there was quite a bit of protest at that time. There was protest of the war in Vietnam. That was considered to be not such a great war. You know, it was unclear what the purpose was. We were just over there. Young men were dying as soldiers, and it was not clear why we were even there. Similar to some of these wars in the Mideast that we've been involved with recently, to my way of thinking. That's a little bit of a radical position, perhaps. But just now, I can really see that there's a sense that the 60s have not really gone away. They've been an underground stream that has percolated through to the present, and now is coming out in more obvious ways. And in fact, you know, since that was Uranus and Pluto, it makes sense to me that Uranus and Pluto are both prominent in the solstice eclipse that we're seeing right now, and what that might tell us about what's going on in this country, what's going on in the world, that there is in fact a resurgence of those liberal principles, those progressive ideals that has to do with climate change as well, and that brings back in the idea of Haumea and Makemake, which is more of an activist energy towards Earth issues, climate change, if you will, which is also at an angle to retrograde Venus. There's a trine to position Makemake in Libra, ruled by Venus. So, and there was a big presence of both Haumea and Makemake in the Earth Day. That was another new moon event on April 22nd. So anyway, I just think that this is a very profound time, and there is a shift that's happening in the society, and it's just something we need to pay attention to. And with that, I will give you a little poetic interlude here. I think you'll recognize these words. Come, gather round, people, wherever you roam, and admit that the waters around you have grown, and accept it that soon you'll be drenched to the bone. If your time for you is worth saving, you better start swimming or you'll sink like a stone, for the times they are changing. Come writers and critics who prophesize with your pen, and keep your eyes wide open, Keep your eyes wide, the chance won't come again. Don't speak too soon, for the wheel's still in spin. And there's no telling who that it's naming, for the loser now will be later to win. The times they are changing. Come senators, congressmen, please heed the call. Don't stand in the doorway, don't block up the hall. For he that gets hurt will be he that who is stalled. The battle is outside and it's raging, and it will soon shake your windows and rattle your walls, for the times they are changing. I just think it's so fascinating, to hear this anthem written in the early 60s for the civil rights movement that was just burgeoning at that time. Of course, Bob Dylan's song, Times They Are Changing. So relevant to what's going on right now. Ends with the line it is drawn, the curse it is cast. The slow one now will later be fast. The present now will later be past. The order is rapidly fading. And the first one now will later be last, for the times they are changing. So that's a profound statement that comes straight from the 60s, and I'm trying to give you the astrological background for that, so that you can see that that does make a little bit of sense in this current timing of this current eclipse energy. And it's interesting to me also that it brings these new planets in, because the thing that that Eris brings to this table, which is fascinating to me, is Eris being a feminine warrior energy for soul intention, for standing up for yourself. A perfect exemplar being Greta Thunberg, who has a very strong Eris in her chart, and that was obvious to me without even looking at the chart that she exemplified Eris, a feminine warrior, speaking truth to power, not taking any crap from anybody, not caring what anybody thought, being ruthless in the exercise of her intention. That's been true of all the feminist leaders I could find that had also strong Eris. It's been true of paradigm shifters. And it's all in my book called The 10th Planet, which is called The Astrological Eris, Revelations from the Astrological Eris. And I did kind of nail the archetype, for which I'm kind of surprised in a way. It's pretty amazing that came about, but I just kind of got a hit of it and then started researching lots and lots of charts, and came to a very good understanding of it. And now it's been proven out everywhere I look as I see Eris in people's charts. And then opposite one of these other new planets, which has to do with nature, the call of nature, understanding nature as a foundational element in everything we do. As Jung pointed out, the unconscious is a big part of our lives. It's not very obvious, it's hidden away, but it is a factor of nature. And that is what he said also, and he has strong Haumea in his chart as well. So that combination with Eris there, everybody has to stand up for themselves. Everybody has to kind of come to the, show up, stand up and say what's on their mind, say what they believe, come to that belief, understand what is necessary at a deep level to really, to be true to yourself, to really be your most authentic self. That's what Eris is all about. And Eris in this T-square with Pluto, with Jupiter joining Pluto by the end of the month, with, by the way, Mars moving into Aries, 0 degrees of Aries, by the 28th, which is the next first quarter of the actual new moon that we're in the midst of. By this end of the month, I expect to see more action. It really is. I mean, having Mars in 0 degrees of Aries square the eclipse degree, you see that activates the eclipse also only a week later. And we're going to be seeing some tough times. And then the question becomes, what's the rest of the year going to be like? And that's where astrologers, it's very interesting. And you can find it in my YouTube channel. In late 2017, there was a thing called the 2020 Summit that Daniel Giammario put together, and he invited me to be part of. And I talked about how Eris was part of this configuration in the early part of this year that we're in now, and also in the November 15th conjunction, triple conjunction of Jupiter, Pluto, and Saturn, because Saturn moves back to join them. And so, and they are retrograde now, but they move back to direct motion, and that's going to happen around the middle of November is the strongest point of that. Still with Eris almost perfectly square to Saturn. Almost perfectly square to Pluto in this arrangement that has Saturn, Jupiter, and Pluto in it, which is then followed by, after November 15th, followed by Jupiter and Saturn both moving together into, and finally having their perfect conjunction at 0 degrees of Aquarius, the first time it's been in an air sign for 200 years, except for one exception in the 60s, 61. Fascinating thing, because as the Great Conjunction, so-called, moves from Earth signs to air signs, after 200 years as Earth signs, we expect to see a sort of an Aquarian thing happening. You know, we expect to see more humanism. We expect to see more internet, for that matter. We expect to see more reliance on each other, more consciousness of the group effort involved in a society, less of the individual fighting for their own greedy needs without the society, and a little bit more cooperation, so that we're entering a new phase. That's what everybody's been saying, all astrologers have been saying, and I just think it's fascinating to see this middle point of the year where it's obvious that things are changing right now. And that it involves each one of us. Well, that's what the message of Eris is, that everybody's got to stand up and be counted. And the message of Haumea is that there is a fundamental truth there, that there is something about nature and natural law. You could call it God if you want. You could call it angel guidance. You could call it your higher self. There's a way that there is something beyond this 3D physical reality that we can see, taste, and touch, that goes to our imagination, that goes to other dimensionality, that makes it possible for the meaning of astrology to come through, even though there's no physical reasoning for that. You know, this is the planets out there in space, but yet, well, it's amazing what it tells us, right? So, in an individual natal chart as well. So, fascinating as that is, it's even more fascinating that it opens up the idea that there is a purpose, just as people have thought all along. The spiritual side of mankind has been part of the understanding right up until perhaps the Enlightenment, which noted astrologer Robert Hand calls the Endarkenment, when it was kind of decided that really all we needed was our rational mind, that we could figure out the reasons and understand the physics behind everything. And of course that's been changed in this 20th century experience of physics, this postmodern era, where we realize that it's much more complicated than we ever thought. Newton was too much of a simplification. As brilliant as it was, as much of a paradigm shift as it was oversimplified. And now we're seeing, remarkably, modern physics coming closer to Eastern spirituality than it was ever before, you know, in this 18th century rational period that we've been living out all this time. So we're seeing a great shift of the ages right now. And it's really quite important to recognize what we're in the midst of, you know, to see the direction the history is moving, to decide where we stand, you know, to try to get on the side of where we think it's going. Because true freedom lies in understanding your place in the history that's moving forward, and really enjoying that and understanding it in that way, that, you know, you're not fighting against the tide, you're swimming with the tide. So I think that's about all I wanted to say here. It's kind of a mouthful. I think you do understand that these are really amazing times that we're living through. And the astrology can help us realize that. I know a couple of announcements. One is that we are putting all the software on sale for an eclipse, special eclipse flash sale that will be in the timing of this eclipse weekend. So that'll be really good for anybody that wants to get their hands on what we've got. We do have different levels of the software, making it easy to get in, and then you can always upgrade. And then the other thing that I wanted to mention is I'm giving a talk on new planets that includes Haumea and Makemake, these two new ones, as well as Eris. And we're doing a workshop, a weekend workshop, that's actually based on a friend of mine in Norway is doing the workshop with me, because she's been very interested in these new planets also. So the two of us are doing it together. It's going to be a Zoom thing, and I believe the link is in the comments section of this Facebook Live, and then also you can find out if you've seen our newsletters, I think. So that's coming up this weekend, actually, at 9 o'clock Pacific time, 9 o'clock in the morning on Saturday and Sunday for 3 hours each time. And it would be, of course, 3 hours later on the East Coast, and it will be 6 o'clock in the evening in Eastern European time, which is Norway. So I'm pretty much talked out. Let me transition back. So that's what we have to say. I mean, if there's any questions, I could respond. I don't know how many people are tuned in at the moment, but if not,
there's one question from the audience, Henry.
Oh, okay, we do have one. Go.
Stephanie is asking, can you predict an end to the virus's massive impact on the world?
That's a great question. Yes, that is something I meant to bring up, actually, talking about these configurations. So when I first saw the Saturn-Pluto of January 10th and realized that that was totally coincident with the naming of COVID-19 as a disease, the identification of a new coronavirus, a novel coronavirus, and the naming of the illness, I realized how close that corresponded. And of course, Saturn-Pluto is associated with the massive societal shift. We've been talking about it ever since a couple of years ago. It was going to be a big cultural shift in 2020, sure enough. We never suspected it was going to be a pandemic and that the whole economy was going to stop in the middle of the year like it has. But it is a good opportunity, though, this COVID, isn't it? It's a good opportunity for us to take stock and realize where we're at, what's going on, look inside. With Mercury retrograde coming up, there'll be even more of a chance to look inside. That's happening in just a couple of days. It'll be before the actual eclipse. So Mercury is retrograde in this eclipse scheme, which I didn't mention, at 14 degrees of Cancer. So that's another factor that's going on, that we'll be doing some deep thinking as we go through this eclipse situation. I didn't really share the screen there. I just was referencing the chart for my own purposes. So in the chart, it's at 14 degrees of Aquarius. So, in the chart, Mercury's retrograding at 14 degrees of Cancer. But that brings me to the question. So the question is, what do we see for the rest of the year? And in fact, because Saturn, Pluto, and also Pluto, Jupiter are so involved with this pandemic, the fact that there's going to be a triple conjunction of Saturn, Pluto, and Jupiter in November 15th, around that point, makes me think that there will be, it'll get worse before it gets better by the end of the year, is what I'm thinking. Some people, epidemiologists, have predicted a second wave at that time. Who knows? I mean, that is what happened in the 1918-1919 flu pandemic, which was much worse in the winter of 1918 and into 1919. That may be the case again. There is talk about having a vaccine by the end of the year, but the problem there is distribution. It has to actually be available to people on a mass scale throughout the world, and that takes time. Of course, the vaccine has to be checked out first, that it doesn't have any side effects, and that takes time. I do think that the logic of the situation kind of points to having further difficulties with COVID this year before the vaccine is available, and that could be what this. There is going to be a lot of chaos at the end of the year, for sure. Probably political chaos as well after the election, because that could be a big transition, a big difficult transition. And I think we're in for, now that doesn't mean doom and gloom, though. I mean, really, I think these are all opportunities, opportunities to show character, opportunities to make the best of it, make the best of the situation, opportunities to act in accordance with safety. Don't forget your face mask. Social distancing, always very important in this time. All the health people have been saying that masks are important, especially when people are crowded close together. And just being conscious of what's going on. If you're shouting and singing loudly, there's moisture coming out of your mouth. And if everybody around you is doing that and somebody is infected and they don't know it, so testing is important. All those things, just we have to be smart and we have to pay attention, which is similar to the way we have to deal with climate change, which is coming down also. We have to be smart, we have to pay attention. And we have to pay attention to what the science tells us, that it is carbon in the atmosphere and other greenhouse gases that's causing the temperatures to rise and the weather to become unstable. So, there's a lot to deal with right now. And the question is how, as a culture and as individuals, we deal with it. And I think that's the answer to that. So I can't be 100% sure there's going to be a further outbreak by the end of the year, but it doesn't, to me, it doesn't look good until next year. And I would believe, and this is more from my understanding of what the vaccine is capable of being developed, I would believe that by the spring of 2021, there will probably be, and this is, I'm not a crystal ball gazer, but this probably will be a different situation as far as the safety of everybody with the exposure to COVID. So I guess that wraps it up, unless, was there any further questions that came? I'm not hearing any.
I think that's all.
Okay. Well, I think that's a good time to wrap it up too. So be safe, be well out there, have a positive attitude. You know, it's not the end of things. It's really the beginning of a new thing. There's always the chaos, and there's always, with Pluto, you know, there's always the chaos. And a wise man once said, you know, there's chaos, but the chaos precedes the birth. Do not dwell on the chaos, but await the birth. And that's what we're in the midst of, is waiting for, not waiting around, but being actively involved in attempting to birth a new humanity, a new society that will be more kind. So that's it. Good luck with all of it, and we'll be talking to you soon. Bye now.